"You're exactly what's wrong with this generation of soldiers," Drill Sergeant Mark Reynolds barked across the parade ground, his voice carrying over the cool morning air and stopping every conversation in its tracks. More than 100 recruits turned their heads at once. Some exchanged glances. Others smirked. Standing alone in the center of the formation was Emma Walker. She didn't argue. She didn't look away. She simply stood at attention beneath the pale light of the rising sun. Fort Carson was already alive with activity. Boots struck pavement. Commands echoed across training fields. Flags snapped in the breeze. Yet for a few seconds, the entire training company seemed focused on one woman. Reynolds slowly paced around her, studying her worn uniform with visible disappointment. "You show up looking like this, and you expect people to take you seriously?" he demanded. A few recruits laughed quietly. Emma remained motionless. Her boots were older than most of the equipment issued to the trainees. The fabric on her sleeves showed signs of years of use. Nothing about her appearance matched the polished image people expected from someone arriving at a prestigious leadership development program. Reynolds stopped directly in front of her. "What's your name?" he asked sharply. "Emma Walker, sir." Her answer was calm and steady. "Walker," Reynolds repeated. "You don't look like leadership material to me." More laughter spread through the formation. Emma said nothing. That silence only seemed to irritate him further. The drill sergeant had spent more than 20 years training soldiers. He believed he could read people within seconds. Confidence, fear, discipline, weakness. In his mind, Emma had already failed the test. "Today," Reynolds announced, turning toward the formation, "Private Walker here is going to serve as an example." The recruits straightened immediately. Nobody wanted to become an example on the first day. An example of what happens when someone arrives unprepared. Several heads nodded. A few recruits looked at Emma with sympathy. Most simply watched, relieved that the attention was not on them. Emma kept her eyes forward. The wind moved a loose strand of hair near her temple, but she never broke posture. There was something unusual about her composure. Not confidence exactly. Not defiance. Something quieter. Something harder to define. Reynolds noticed it, but dismissed the feeling. "You think this is a game?" he asked. "No, sir." "You think respect is automatic?" "No, sir." "Then maybe there's hope for you after all." The recruits chuckled again. Reynolds continued walking around her, building momentum with every comment. Yet while the crowd focused on his words, a few veteran instructors standing near the administration building had begun paying closer attention to Emma Walker. One of them narrowed his eyes. Another slowly lowered the clipboard in his hands. Neither said a word. They simply watched. Because there was something familiar about the woman standing calmly in the center of the field while an entire company laughed at her. And for reasons they could not yet explain, they had the growing feeling that Drill Sergeant Reynolds was making a mistake he would soon regret. The morning briefing should have ended there, but Drill Sergeant Reynolds was not finished. He looked down the line of recruits and pointed toward a stack of weighted training packs resting near the edge of the field. Walker, front and center. Emma stepped forward immediately. The company watched with growing curiosity. Reynolds picked up one of the packs and dropped it onto the pavement beside her boots. The sound echoed across the training ground. "You are going to carry this during every movement today," he announced. "Maybe it will teach you what preparation looks like." Several recruits exchanged knowing smiles. Nobody volunteered for extra weight. Nobody wanted additional attention. Yet Emma simply bent down, lifted the pack, and secured it across her shoulders without hesitation. Reynolds seemed disappointed by her lack of reaction. He had expected frustration, maybe embarrassment. Instead, he got nothing. The company began moving toward the obstacle course that stretched across a nearby field. Tall climbing structures, balance beams, rope stations, and endurance lanes filled the area. The recruits immediately focused on the challenge ahead. Emma moved with the group, never rushing and never falling behind. Reynolds watched her carefully from a distance. During the first station, several recruits struggled to maintain their footing. A few lost balance and had to start over. Emma completed the obstacle with the same calm expression she had worn all morning. At the next station, a recruit beside her slipped and nearly dropped his equipment. Before the instructors could react, Emma reached out, steadied the pack, and allowed the young man to regain control. She never broke stride. "Thank you," he said quietly. Emma nodded once and continued forward. The gesture lasted only seconds, but several people noticed. One of the veteran instructors standing near the course folded his arms and continued watching. There was something unusual about her awareness. She seemed to notice everything around her without appearing distracted. Hours passed. The Colorado sun climbed higher. Fatigue began showing across the faces of the recruits. Shirts darkened with sweat. Conversations became shorter. Yet Emma maintained the same measured pace. She never tried to stand out. She never tried to impress anyone. She simply completed each task exactly as instructed. Reynolds grew increasingly irritated. Every challenge he expected to expose weakness seemed to accomplish the opposite. During a short water break, he approached a group of instructors gathered near the administrative tent. "What is it with her?" he asked. One of the older instructors glanced toward Emma, who was sitting alone beneath a small patch of shade, quietly drinking water. "What do you mean?" the instructor replied. Reynolds frowned. "She acts like none of this bothers her." The instructor studied Emma for another moment. "Maybe because it does not." Reynolds shook his head. "Everybody has a breaking point." The instructor did not answer. Across the field, Emma tightened the strap on her training pack and stood before the whistle sounded. A light breeze moved across the parade ground. For a brief second, the sleeve of her uniform shifted just enough to reveal a faint scar near her forearm before the fabric settled back into place. One instructor noticed it immediately. His expression changed. He looked at Emma again, this time with far greater attention. And for the first time that day, a quiet sense of recognition began to form. The afternoon training cycle began with a field leadership exercise that Reynolds personally supervised. By now, the recruits were tired, hungry, and eager for the day to end. That made mistakes easier to spot and discipline easier to enforce. Reynolds gathered the company near a navigation course marked by a series of checkpoints spread across several acres of open terrain. "Leadership is not about talking," he announced. "It is about performance under pressure." His eyes immediately found Emma. "Walker, step forward." She obeyed without hesitation. The recruits exchanged glances. They had begun expecting her name to be called. Reynolds seemed determined to keep the spotlight on her. "You are leading the first team." A few surprised looks appeared across the formation. Earlier that morning, he had questioned whether she belonged there at all. Now he was putting her in charge. Emma accepted the assignment with a simple nod. No excitement. No nervousness. Nothing. The team moved onto the course. Several recruits immediately began debating directions. Others argued over maps and markers. Emma listened quietly for a moment before pointing toward a distant ridge. "We go that way." Her voice was calm but confident. Nobody challenged her. There was something about the way she spoke that made people pay attention. The team followed. 20 minutes later, they reached the first checkpoint ahead of every other group. More checkpoints followed. Each time Emma made quick decisions. Each time her team arrived first. She never celebrated. She never claimed credit. She simply kept moving. Back near the observation area, Reynolds watched through binoculars. His expression tightened with each successful checkpoint. One instructor standing beside him finally spoke. "She has done this before." Reynolds lowered the binoculars. "Done what?" "Led people." Reynolds dismissed the comment. Anybody can get lucky. But even he no longer sounded convinced. Late in the exercise, a sudden weather shift pushed strong winds across the training grounds. Maps fluttered. Dust rolled through the open field. Several teams became disoriented and began missing markers. Emma's team slowed briefly. She studied the landscape, adjusted course, and continued forward. Less than 15 minutes later, her group crossed the final checkpoint. They finished first by a wide margin. The recruits around her looked impressed. One of them finally asked the question many had been wondering all day. "How did you know where to go?" Emma adjusted the strap on her pack. "Pay attention long enough, and the terrain tells you." The answer only deepened the mystery. Back at the assembly area, Reynolds called the company together. The recruits stood in formation while scores were recorded. Emma returned to her position near the rear of the group. She seemed perfectly content to disappear back into the crowd. Then something unexpected happened. A gust of wind swept across the field. Papers shifted. Equipment rattled. The collar of Emma's uniform moved slightly. One of the veteran instructors standing nearby suddenly froze. For just a second, he caught sight of a small insignia pinned beneath the fabric where most people would never think to look. His eyes widened. He took a step closer. Then another. The recognition that had begun earlier now became certainty. He looked from Emma to Reynolds and back again. The drill sergeant was still focused on his clipboard, completely unaware that the story he thought he understood was about to change. The day should have been winding down, but the atmosphere around the training grounds felt different now. Word traveled quickly in military environments, and although nobody knew exactly who Emma Walker was, people had started asking questions. Recruits who had laughed that morning now watched her with curiosity. Instructors who had ignored her arrival now paid close attention whenever she moved across the field. The veteran instructor who had recognized the hidden insignia remained silent. He understood something important. If Emma wanted her history known, she would have revealed it herself. Instead, she carried herself like someone determined to remain unnoticed. Unfortunately for her, Reynolds was becoming increasingly determined to prove his original judgment correct. As evening approached, he organized one final evaluation before dismissal. The company assembled near a leadership reaction course filled with practical challenges designed to test decision-making rather than physical strength. Wooden barriers, equipment stations, and problem-solving checkpoints stretched across the training area. Reynolds stepped in front of the formation. "Most people fail because they think experience makes them special," he announced. "The moment you believe you are better than everyone else is the moment you stop learning." His gaze settled briefly on Emma. Several recruits noticed. Emma did not react. Reynolds divided the company into teams. Once again, Emma found herself assigned responsibility for a group. Some recruits seemed relieved. Others seemed surprised. Earlier that day, they had assumed she was struggling. Now they had watched her consistently outperform expectations. The exercise began. Teams spread across the course. Instructions were intentionally incomplete. Time limits were strict. Confusion appeared almost immediately. Voices overlapped. Different solutions competed for attention. Emma listened carefully while her team debated options. Then she calmly pointed out a simpler approach that nobody else had considered. Within minutes, the obstacle was complete. The team moved forward. At the next station, the same thing happened. While other groups argued, Emma observed. While others rushed, she evaluated. Her team steadily advanced through each challenge. Reynolds watched from a distance. His frustration grew harder to hide. Every result contradicted the picture he had built in his mind. The recruits noticed it too. One young trainee quietly asked another, "Who is she?" The second recruit shook his head. "I do not know, but she is definitely not who I thought she was." Near sunset, the final challenge ended. Emma's team finished first once again. The company gathered for after-action review while instructors discussed results. As the recruits stood in formation, Reynolds walked directly toward Emma. The field became noticeably quieter. "Walker," he said sharply. "Step forward." She obeyed. Reynolds circled her slowly. "Interesting day," he said. "You seem to know more than you should for someone who arrived looking completely unprepared." A few recruits shifted uncomfortably. The comment sounded less like criticism now and more like suspicion. Emma remained calm. "I followed instructions, sir." Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "That is not an answer." For the first time all day, the veteran instructor took a step forward as though considering whether to intervene. Then he stopped. Emma gave the slightest shake of her head. The instructor understood immediately and remained silent. Reynolds missed the exchange entirely. He was too focused on proving himself right. As he continued studying her uniform, his attention drifted toward a section of fabric near her shoulder. Something beneath the material created a faint outline. Not enough to identify, just enough to raise questions. Reynolds frowned. Whatever certainty he had possessed that morning was beginning to crack. And the closer he looked, the more he realized that Emma Walker was carrying a story he had completely failed to see. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the mountains when the company was finally dismissed from the training field. Most recruits headed toward the barracks exhausted from the long day, but conversations continued wherever small groups gathered. Emma Walker had become the topic no one could fully explain. Some believed she had transferred from another leadership program. Others thought she might be prior service. A few recruits were convinced she had simply gotten lucky throughout the day's evaluations. Emma ignored the speculation. She quietly collected her equipment and began walking toward the administrative building to complete her processing paperwork. The weighted training pack was still slung across her shoulders. Not because she had been ordered to carry it anymore, but because she saw no reason to complain about it. Across the field, Reynolds watched her leave. Something about the entire day bothered him. Every assumption he had made that morning felt less certain than before. He had expected excuses. He had expected frustration. Instead, he had found discipline, experience, patience, qualities that usually took years to develop. The veteran instructor approached him slowly. "Long day," he said. Reynolds nodded. "For some people." The instructor glanced toward Emma. "You know, first impressions can be dangerous." Reynolds folded his arms. "If you have something to say, then say it." The older man hesitated. For a moment it looked as though he might reveal everything. Then he simply smiled. "I think you should spend more time observing and less time assuming." Reynolds frowned. Before he could respond, the instructor walked away. The comment lingered in his mind long after the conversation ended. Meanwhile, Emma entered the administrative building. The interior was quiet compared to the training grounds outside. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Clerks organized paperwork behind long counters. A few officers moved between offices carrying folders and reports. Emma approached a processing desk and handed over several documents. The civilian employee reviewing them suddenly paused. Her eyes moved from the paperwork to Emma and back again. "Just a moment," she said. Emma nodded. The employee disappeared into a nearby office. A minute later, she returned accompanied by a captain. The captain looked at Emma, then at the paperwork, and immediately straightened his posture. "Good evening, ma'am," he said respectfully. Emma offered a polite nod. "Good evening, Captain." The exchange lasted only seconds, but it did not go unnoticed. Standing near the entrance, Reynolds had arrived to deliver end-of-day reports. He happened to witness the interaction from across the room. His eyebrows narrowed. Something about the captain's reaction seemed unusual. Not fear, not nervousness. Respect. Genuine respect. The kind usually reserved for someone whose reputation had already been earned. Before Reynolds could move closer, Emma finished her paperwork and thanked the staff. As she turned to leave, the edge of her uniform jacket shifted slightly. For the briefest moment, something metallic reflected the overhead light from inside an inner pocket. Reynolds caught the flash but could not identify it. Emma adjusted her jacket and continued toward the exit. The object disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Reynolds remained standing in the middle of the administrative office long after she left. For the first time all day, he found himself asking a question he should have asked from the beginning. Who exactly was Emma Walker? The next morning arrived colder than the day before. A thin layer of mist hovered above the training grounds as recruits assembled before sunrise. Conversations that normally filled the formation area were noticeably quieter. Emma Walker's performance had become impossible to ignore. Nobody knew her story, but nobody viewed her as an ordinary newcomer anymore. Emma arrived carrying the same calm expression she always seemed to wear. She took her place in formation without seeking attention. Reynolds noticed immediately. So did nearly everyone else. The difference was that this time people were watching her with curiosity instead of amusement. The morning evaluation focused on equipment readiness and professional standards. Rows of soldiers stood while instructors inspected uniforms, gear, and documentation. It was routine work, usually uneventful. Reynolds moved down the line conducting inspections personally. When he reached Emma, he stopped longer than necessary. The recruits nearby sensed it immediately. He examined her uniform, her equipment, and every visible detail with unusual attention. "Step forward," he ordered. Emma complied. Reynolds began inspecting her field jacket. His expression suggested he was searching for something. Maybe a mistake. Maybe proof that his instincts had been right all along. The formation remained silent. Even the instructors seemed unusually attentive. Reynolds adjusted part of the jacket near the shoulder where he had noticed an unusual outline the previous evening. "What is this?" he asked. "Personal property secured according to regulations, sir," Emma answered calmly. The response only increased his curiosity. Reynolds carefully checked the interior pocket. The movement was routine, nothing inappropriate, nothing aggressive. Yet the moment his hand touched the contents, his expression changed. He slowly withdrew a small protective case. Several recruits leaned forward. The case was old but meticulously maintained. Emma remained perfectly still. The veteran instructor standing nearby immediately recognized it. His face tightened. Reynolds opened the case. For a second, he simply stared. The confidence that had driven every criticism during the previous day seemed to disappear. Inside rested a service medal. Not decorative, not ceremonial, the kind awarded only after extraordinary service. The morning air suddenly felt very quiet. Reynolds looked from the medal to Emma, then back to the medal. Around them, nobody spoke. Most recruits did not fully understand what they were seeing, but they understood enough to recognize that something significant had just happened. The veteran instructor finally stepped forward. "You should look at the citation," he said quietly. Reynolds unfolded the accompanying document. His eyes moved across the page. The color gradually drained from his face. Every assumption he had made began collapsing at once. The woman he had singled out, questioned, and publicly doubted was not an inexperienced recruit struggling to keep up. She was a soldier whose record reflected years of service, leadership, and sacrifice. Emma never smiled, never celebrated, never attempted to embarrass anyone. She simply stood there with the same quiet professionalism she had displayed since arriving. For the first time since meeting her, Reynolds found himself completely speechless. And as the realization settled across the formation, every person standing on that field understood they were witnessing the moment when appearances stopped matching and the truth finally began to emerge. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The formation stood frozen beneath the pale morning sky, while Reynolds continued staring at the document in his hands. The recruits could not read the citation from where they stood, but they could read his expression. The certainty that had defined him for the past 2 days was gone. In its place was something much rarer: doubt. The veteran instructor finally broke the silence. "Read the last section." Reynolds swallowed and lowered his eyes to the page again. The words seemed heavier the second time. Recognition for exceptional leadership. Recognition for service under demanding conditions. Recognition for achievements that most soldiers spent entire careers trying to earn. None of it matched the image he had created of Emma Walker. Around the formation, whispers began spreading. "Who is she?" one recruit quietly asked. Another shook his head. "I do not know, but this is not normal." Emma remained perfectly composed. She did not look proud. She did not look embarrassed. If anything, she looked slightly uncomfortable that attention had shifted toward her. The veteran instructor stepped closer. "You never told them?" Emma offered a small shrug. Nobody asked. A few recruits exchanged surprised looks. The answer sounded so simple that it was almost impossible to believe. Reynolds slowly closed the case and looked directly at her. "Why would you carry this and never mention it?" Emma met his gaze. "Because it does not change today's work." The response landed harder than any explanation could have. Every recruit on the field heard it. Some lowered their eyes. Others stood a little straighter. The words carried the weight of experience without sounding like a lesson. At that moment, a black government vehicle rolled onto the edge of the training grounds. Its arrival immediately caught the attention of the instructors. The vehicle stopped near the administration building, and a senior officer stepped out. The moment several instructors recognized him, their posture changed. The officer crossed the field with purpose. His eyes found Emma almost immediately. When he reached the formation, he did not look at Reynolds first. He looked directly at Emma. "Good morning, Sergeant Walker." The title moved through the formation like a wave. Several recruits blinked in confusion. Others stared openly. Reynolds looked stunned. "Sergeant. Not trainee. Not newcomer. Sergeant." Emma nodded respectfully. "Good morning, sir." The senior officer smiled. "I apologize for the delay. Headquarters needed additional confirmation before your assignment could be officially announced." A heavy silence followed. Reynolds seemed unable to look away. Assignment? Official announcement? Every new answer only created more questions. The officer turned toward the instructors. "Sergeant Walker is here as part of a leadership evaluation initiative. Her performance and observations will be included in a training assessment being reviewed at a much higher level." Nobody spoke. The realization spread slowly across the field. Emma had not been there to prove herself. She had been there to observe, to evaluate, to learn. And perhaps, without intending to, she had revealed something important about everyone around her. Reynolds glanced toward the recruits who had laughed during the first morning formation. Then he looked back at Emma. For the first time since meeting her, he understood that the quiet woman standing in front of him had never been trying to earn respect. She had already earned it long before arriving at Fort Carson. The training field remained silent long after the senior officer finished speaking. The recruits stood motionless, trying to process everything they had just learned. Only 48 hours earlier, Most of them had assumed Emma Walker was simply another arrival struggling to fit in. Now they were discovering that the quiet woman they had underestimated had been evaluating the very environment they thought she was trying to join. The senior officer exchanged a few words with the instructors before stepping aside. His presence alone had already changed the atmosphere. Conversations that might have happened privately were now unfolding in front of the entire company. Reynolds remained standing near Emma, still holding the protective case that had altered the course of the morning. For perhaps the first time in years, he seemed unsure of what to say. Emma noticed. She could see the conflict on his face. Pride, regret, reflection. None of it was hidden very well. Across the formation, recruits who had laughed during the first morning now avoided looking directly at her. Others studied her with a completely different kind of attention. Not admiration. Respect. The kind earned through actions rather than introductions. The veteran instructor finally stepped forward and addressed the company. What have all of you learned? Nobody answered immediately. The question seemed simple, but everyone understood it carried more weight than a normal training lesson. A recruit near the front finally spoke. Do not judge people too quickly. The instructor nodded. Good start. Another recruit raised his voice. Performance matters more than appearance. Again, the instructor nodded. Better. Emma listened quietly. She had no interest in becoming the center of a motivational speech. Yet she understood why the moment mattered. Training was supposed to reveal character. Sometimes it revealed the character of the observer as much as the person being observed. Reynolds slowly handed the metal case back to her. His movements were careful, respectful, very different from the confidence he had displayed on the first day. I should have asked questions before making assumptions, he said. The admission surprised everyone. Drill Sergeant Reynolds was not known for public self-criticism. Emma accepted the case and secured it inside her jacket. We all make judgments, she replied. The important part is what we do after realizing we were wrong. Several recruits exchanged glances. The response carried no bitterness, no attempt to embarrass him. That seemed to affect Reynolds more than any criticism could have. The senior officer watched the exchange with quiet approval. He understood leadership well enough to recognize what was happening. Emma could have used the moment to elevate herself. Instead, she had chosen to protect the dignity of the person who had doubted her. That decision revealed more about her character than any citation ever could. As the morning inspection finally resumed, something subtle changed throughout the formation. Recruits listened more carefully. Instructors paid closer attention to their words. Even Reynolds carried himself differently. The lesson had moved beyond Emma Walker. It had become a lesson for everyone standing on that field. And although the truth about her service had finally begun to emerge, the most important revelation was not the medal, the assignment, or the recognition. It was the realization that true professionalism often arrives quietly, asks for no attention, and speaks for itself long before anyone discovers the story behind it. By the end of the week, life at Fort Carson had settled back into its normal rhythm. Training schedules continued. Inspections continued. New challenges appeared every day. Yet something had changed beneath the surface. The recruits who had witnessed the events of those 2 days carried the lesson with them wherever they went. Emma Walker remained exactly the same person she had been when she first stepped onto the training field. She still arrived early. She still listened more than she spoke. She still completed every assignment without drawing attention to herself. The difference was that people finally understood what they were seeing. Respect followed her now, but she never seemed to notice. Or perhaps she simply never cared about it in the first place. One afternoon, Reynolds stood near the obstacle course watching a new group of recruits struggle through a leadership exercise. Their mistakes reminded him of the assumptions he had made only days earlier. He spotted Emma crossing the far side of the field carrying a folder from the administration building. Several recruits passed her and immediately greeted her with professional respect. She returned each greeting with the same simple nod. Nothing more. Reynolds found himself smiling slightly. The veteran instructor noticed. You learned something too, he said. Reynolds nodded. More than I expected. The instructor folded his arms. That is usually how the best lessons work. Later that evening, the company gathered for a closing briefing. The recruits stood in formation while instructors reviewed the week's performance. As the briefing concluded, Reynolds stepped forward. His voice carried across the field with the same authority everyone recognized. Before dismissal, I want to leave you with something important. The formation became silent. You will meet people throughout your careers who do not look impressive at first glance. You will meet people who speak quietly, who do not advertise their accomplishments, and who never ask for recognition. He paused briefly. Many recruits already knew where the lesson was heading. Never mistake humility for weakness. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words carried more weight because they came from him. Reynolds glanced toward Emma, who stood near the edge of the formation, listening like everyone else. Character reveals itself over time. If you judge people too quickly, you may miss the very qualities you should respect the most. Several recruits nodded. Others looked thoughtful. The lesson no longer belonged to one person. It belonged to everyone standing there. As the formation was finally dismissed, soldiers began heading toward the barracks beneath the fading light of sunset. Emma turned to leave as well. Before she could walk away, Reynolds approached her one final time. "Sergeant Walker." She stopped. "Sir." For a moment, Reynolds seemed to search for the right words. Then he simply said, "Thank you." Emma looked slightly surprised. "For what?" Reynolds glanced toward the recruits crossing the field. "For reminding all of us what professionalism actually looks like." Emma considered the answer for a second before offering a small smile. "People usually reveal who they are if you give them enough time." Reynolds nodded. "I will remember that." Emma adjusted the folder beneath her arm and continued toward the administration building. The evening sun stretched long shadows across the training grounds as she disappeared into the distance. Around her, Fort Carson continued its daily routine. New recruits would arrive. New lessons would be taught. But long after the details faded, the people who had stood on that field would remember one simple truth. Respect is not earned by appearances, rank, or reputation alone. It is earned by character. And character always reveals itself eventually.